Two Amazon procurement nerds are back, recording on Sunday here in the Bay Area. Absolutely stunning, beautiful weather. We're hoping after we record, we'll sneak out and both get hikes in today, but definitely a good day to get vitamin D.
It's gorgeous day here in the Bay Area. I can't even. We're March 9th and it's sunny, little chill in the air, but just absolutely the day that we live for here in the Bay Area and go out and enjoy.
This is why we pay a fortune to live in California.
Exactly. You could say that again. All right. So today we are going to revisit ESG because there's a lot to talk about since we dissected the issue last year, and quite a number of things have popped up related to ESG. And we are going to do our utmost to stay away from politics, even though the whole term has become uh, absolutely politicized. So just as sort of reset. Well, by the way, before we get into it, and apropos of talking about ESG, happy International Women's Day, Sarah.
Yes, you too. I love seeing all the posts and videos on social media over the last couple of days.
Yeah, that's been fun and probably kind of relevant, ironic. I'm not sure what the right word is, but certainly apropos that we're talking about ESG today.
Yeah,
So,
and I want to make sure one of the triggers of this, and I know Dr. Elouise, you're going to kick us off, but there's been a big lawsuit that's gone down in the industry of supplier IO. So I want to make sure that we will circle back to that because that is very relevant to this topic.
yeah, and it should send shockwaves, or it has sent shockwaves throughout the procurement world, and I think it's forcing us collectively to confront things that we've never, or on rare occasion, have had to deal with something that, and certainly not in the procure tech world. But we'll get into that in a minute. So let's just talk about. I just want to remind listeners, because actually in discussions I've had for the last few weeks, people have different ideas of what ESG is. So at its basic level, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And that is let's call it a framework or a way of structuring how businesses uh, take responsibility for the world that they and the countries and the localities that they operate within. It used to be known as corporate social responsibility. It took on ESG, and it has largely been ESG. Now, within our environmental, that's of course carbon footprint and energy efficiency, waste management, water conservation. Within social would be DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, labor practices and conditions, and consumer protection and community engagement. And governance has to do with diversity, board diversity, compensation structures, ethics, anti-corruption, and so forth. Now, I'm going to try and say this next part without uh, commentary, but in the US, the new presidential administration, the Trump administration, has been very vocally anti DEI and anti ESG. And certainly there's a lot to unpack there. That's not our objective here, but it has created an environment that is very hostile to ESG, to DEI, to just general sustainability. There's an anti-climate or a backlash against climate work. Grants have been have dried up. Anything with diversity in it has come under major criticism and lawsuits, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And in general, anything that seeks to advance society other than, or at least a corporation's place in society or government's place in society and role in society, if there's anything other than pretty much just straight up, I'm going to use this word meritocracy, quote unquote, which I think is also a problematic term. But all of that is the big anti ESG and DEI push has created a huge backlash here in the U.S. And what has come out of that is a large number of big corporations have stepped back. They've removed chief diversity officers, chief whatever, folks that are tasked with ESG, complete sustainability departments have gone away. It's been a huge backlash, and then of course there's been some very public companies like Target, Amazon, Google, Citigroup, the major consulting firms that have big contracts with the government, all eliminated DEI presence, and it's become a very volatile subject. And I think when we had talked about it before, Sarah, we had talked about Harley Davidson and maybe it was
Yeah,
John Deere. Yeah.
at
Anyway.
the time we did the episode last year, this was with the previous administration, and there was a couple companies that were starting to publicly eliminate ESG or diversity programs. And now we've seen that just kind of 10x. And I would say when you look at a lot of the layoffs, which seem to be announcements almost daily, when you dive in, it seems that a part of a lot of the layoffs are around sustainability, ESG, kind of DEI type roles and departments. I've also seen kind of an interesting um, trend where I've seen people now doing kind of a deep dive and research on DEI. And some people are saying, well, they were almost reverse discrimination and
Mhm.
talking about how a lot of the initiatives were actually like discriminatory against white people, or they were being run. I saw a stat, and again, I'm not saying that this is correct in any way, but I saw one research paper that said something like 72% of DEI programs and DEI teams were spearheaded by white people. So that my point is there's a lot of people going in and looking at these programs and trying to pick out different things and saying, should we have done this? Why were we doing this? And now they're just complete elimination.
Yeah. I mean, it has been a wild course correction. Typically, the swings in any, like, whether it's digital or like other sort of corporate outsourcing, insourcing, the swings are not this wild. This is a pretty wild swing that I can recall. Even when we outsourced everything in the late 90s and 2000s, I say we, I didn't, but I'm old enough to remember it was not a while. It took a decade, maybe 15 years to execute that. And this hasn't even been 3 months.
Well, and I would say this is a wake up call for people working in procurement.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of this ESG type work tied to procurement. And, if you are in a position where you're involved in this, figuring out do you have a future? What does that look like? How can you pivot? And for procure tech firms that have solutions and you know programs or a big part of their revenue tied to this, and with it all going away, it's going to be interesting to see how people can pivot and reinvent themselves quickly.
Yeah, and just to sort of in that context, the other thing that oftentimes is the what goes on in Europe is often different than going on in the US. But I also think the EU just passed a major comprehensive recalibration of its environmental goals in particular. And I'm not an expert in this, and I was I was watching and reading couple folks that couple influencers that I like a lot, or folks that have their own startups. Anastasia Kuskova, who is the founder of Sirius, and Daniela Osio, who's the founder of Gloopify, both very, very dynamic founders. And I read a lot of what they post. and they talked about the European watering down of language of what what the EU legislation is, and I'm not even going to pretend that I know what it means, but I also know that it was a major recalibration and it was not going in the direction it had been going. And so I do think a lot of these pushes on corporations, again, I think everybody's pumping the brakes. And to this, your second, your point there about procurement and procure tech, I think ESG, with no offense to Daniela and Anastasia, I think the ESG market and the ESG companies are in trouble because
You've got 3.5 years left of this. Can you survive?
yeah, I don't think they can survive a year without pivoting. Now we can go like, especially like the big companies like EcoVadis. I mean, they built a massive sort of windfall of cash on ESG compliance activities and getting, giving out gold stars or whatever they're giving out. And now that it's just like seems silly. Why would you even pay for that software, much less invest in that kind of? So I think the ESG market, by the way, as I have said 1,000 times before, has to recalibrate.
Yeah, and I would say if I were a procurement practitioner right now and was somehow involved in ESG initiatives, first thing I would be doing is looking at how to merge my efforts and associate with supply chain risk and resilience planning. I mean, I would be whatever I can do to tie myself to larger strategic initiatives that are very revenue metrics based versus more of this kind of marketing fluff high in the sky, which is now the perspective or the viewpoint of these ESG initiatives. So figure out how you can quickly pivot and glom onto and partner with, again, other departments or other initiatives within the organization.
Yeah, and I just was pulling up my my trade wars book because I I I actually will take I'll take a hit for perpetuating this for the procurement. To your point about the procurement, or what the impact is for procurement, and I was just looking through what I wrote, but it is that I said procurement is in a good position to spearhead corporate ESG because of its work with external suppliers and entities, and it sits at the intersection of safety, human rights, diversity, inclusion, etc. And I went on to went on to talk about how with the right data foundation, you can advance these objectives. So I'm not going to sit here and say that I didn't jump on the bandwagon. I also want to flag that I very much got wrapped up in this, and I'm not saying I've abandoned it or I have or have not abandoned it. I'm just pointing out that even if because I like to keep receipts, and I will drag myself on that one because I very much have been a sort of champion of that and sort of talking about that. Now, it's worth noting, just on that note, is that there are a number of companies that have uh, publicly maintained their DEI presence and their ESG presence, and Ben and Jerry's certainly would be at the top of that list. Apple for sure, Costco. All of those have made very public uh, range statements. So it's not a zero sum game, but it's a really wild. I don't know. I keep saying that.
Mhm. Yeah, and again, then you factor in the major lawsuit, which again
Yeah.
just like adds fuel to the fire on top of these layoffs and dismantling of the programs. Then you throw in a major lawsuit, and that just even further disrupts.
All right. So that's a perfect segue. Let's talk about the lawsuit because I think this is to me when I saw this and when I saw this, it absolutely it sounded alarm bells on many fronts. So Why don't you walk us through it? Because I
Yeah.
think this is probably one of the most impactful things I've seen in a long time.
So the the um the topic or the lawsuit, the big question is, will Supplier IO be held liable for supplier diversity discrimination at American Airlines? I want to caveat this. I am by no means an attorney or a legal expert. But I'll just kind of summarize, kind of the key points of the lawsuit. And this would be really interesting for folks listening in to drop notes and comments regarding your thoughts and feedback, because major implications for all organizations now who have ESG programs based on what comes of this lawsuit. Because I don't know the exact dollar amounts, but I'm assuming it's very substantial. And a company like Supplier IO is not a major company with unlimited resources. So not sure if American Airlines will be covering the legal costs of Supplier IO throughout this. Hopefully, Supplier IO has a very solid contract and legal terms. That alone could just decimate companies when you look at the legal costs associated with fighting something like this. But here's what's involved. So, American Alliance for Equal Rights, which is an organization with the initials AAER, has filed a complaint against American Airlines and Supplier IO, accusing them of racial discrimination within their supplier diversity program. So there's a few key points. The first is, and again, this is what's spelled out in their lawsuit: control of the program. Supplier IO is accused of running American Airlines supplier diversity program. Since 2022, businesses have had no choice but to register through Supplier IO and agree to its rigid terms and conditions just to be considered. Point two, enforcing racial requirements. The suit contends that Supplier IO isn't just a passive data platform. It's legally binding agreements force suppliers to fit specific racial categories. If you don't, you are if you don't, you're out. So it's kind of like a very black and white requirement process. Number three, contractual overreach. Beyond racial filtering, the contracts require suppliers to have hand over a treasure trove of data, everything from technical details to personal identifiers, with the company retaining rights to use, copy, and even advertise the information. Suppliers also have to waive any legal claims and indemnify Supplier IO for actions taken on the platform. And the fourth, violations on multiple fronts. The complaint points to potential breaches of something called 42 USC 1981, a Civil Rights Act, alleging that by enforcing racial criteria, Supplier IO and its partners are intentionally discriminating against certain groups, even while benefiting from federal programs like PPP. Specifically, as part of American and Supplier's operating agreement, Supplier IO provides American with an exclusive online platform that's open only to minorities, women, and a few other preferred groups. So those are the four major claims in the lawsuit. So
There's so much in there.
yeah, and I would start by saying this is very complicated, because you could argue Supplier IO is just a middleman.
Right.
They have a platform. Which was procured by American Airlines. American Airlines asked them to set up and implement a program that had specific requirements, and Supplier IO executed that program.
Yeah, this is going to be really thorny. Now, I thought there was, well, there was a line about you could only transact through this platform, or sort of, it was more because it called out that it was not just providing data, it was actually actively engaged in at least the claim in that, in what you read. I heard it say that you had to, it wasn't just passively providing data. And I think that might be a really interesting key. Now, the other thing that jumped out at me is this, is handing over this treasure trove of data, personalized data. This is something that is one of the things that drives me nuts, is that and I think it's going to be lawsuits like this that bring this to the forefront. Is, if I'm a supplier and I give my information over, I should own that. In fact, as a sidebar, and some other time we'll talk about that, I think our data is a human rights for individuals, but I also think it applies to businesses, because as you were reading that, it's like, oh yeah, you have to give all your data to Supplier IO or American Airlines. It wasn't clear who gets the data, but everybody can use it, advertise, do all this stuff with it. And that just seems like a horrible business practice when it gets put into a lawsuit, and now we as the public can react to that, because that just seems like, as an outsider, and I understand why they're doing it, but it just seems so totally unfair.
Now, you could also argue that American Airlines is actually the guilty party here, not Supplier IO, if they specifically ask Supplier IO to, quote, discriminate against white owned businesses. So, if part of the criteria was to make it more difficult for white owned businesses to qualify, that is something that if American Airlines requested that of Supplier IO, you would think that that's their criteria, not necessarily a criteria of the Supplier IO platform.
Well, this gets to, is American going to indemnify Supplier IO for executing that vision? But I wonder, and this is a wonder, like, I have no idea, but I feel like we turned into Joe Rogan wannabes here. I wonder, no, uh, but I wonder, is that enough protection? Because at a certain point, if you are executing against the law, like, let's say, again, this gets to interpretation of the law, but if you're executing, if you're doing something illegal on behalf of somebody else, you're still going to get tagged because you're executing. And so I think this is going to be a very, watching this play out, because I don't know, I
Well,
think you.
so a couple other things that came to mind when I was reading through this. Don't all P2P vendors collect diversity data?
Absolutely.
So
I mean, it's
every
all freely available. I mean, most of it's freely available, but if it's not, you're still sending out surveys. Now, whether companies fill it in, and of course, the more important piece is, the crucial piece is, are you awarding based on those diversity metrics? That's, I think, where it
But
gets
you could
sticky.
argue that all P2P vendors are collecting diversity data in some capacity.
Undoubtedly. And if they don't collect it from the supplier, like just folks like Tealbook and Scalpy and I don't know, whoever else, can go scour the internet and infer it, if not grab it directly.
So then my next point is, do all P2P vendors use diversity criteria as in some way when they're issuing RFPs?
Well, yeah, so I think that would get more towards the sourcing platforms, and because that's where the decision to award the business is. So I think that's where I think it gets gray, or the area gets gray area, because certainly if and let's just pick pick on American, I'm sorry, that when their sourcing managers ran the sourcing events and they awarded the business, did they award the business based on flags, the data that said this is a diverse supplier or not, or did the sourcing tool have a weighting, like a optimization algorithm, that prioritizes diverse suppliers over, let's just call it white suppliers. I don't know what non-diverse suppliers. So then that sourcing tool is actually at issue here. And so I don't know. It's going to get very, like, while this might be a supplier IO thing, this very easily could ensnare other providers.
Well, that's exactly my point. So,
Yeah,
depending on what the outcome here, this could very well impact and provide or trigger a lawsuit friendly organization to go after many other solution providers in the space.
absolutely. And you could probably even back it up to category management. Now, I don't know what the companies were supplying in this case, but if your category manage or category strategy said you should use these diverse suppliers, and sort of then who you invited to the sourcing event before you even awarded to them, I think it's going to be. I think it gets very complicated, and you're right. A very litigious group could go after this big time.
Yeah. So again, my thought here is it's I don't know enough about this to say a strong opinion on, who I think is at fault in this case. But I do think that it's going to be a very challenging time if there is some action, or the folks come after Supplier IO, because if they are simply providing software and then an organization is using it in a specific way, it becomes very challenging for software providers.
Right. And how many supplier information platforms do we know that capture all this diversity information and sustainability information and blah, blah, blah? Like, there was language you were reading that like gets to the heart of that, and is like, should we be doing this? Are we doing this? And I think it could usher in a new era of really contemplating what data we collect and can collect and should collect.
So I think this again ties into our ESG conversation, because I think if you are working in procurement and ESG is some way involved in your role or at your company, you need to be very, very careful about legal ramifications that could be associated with this. So it's really time to take a look at your program and figure out how you can pivot or make changes, to do things like I said. Look at how can you merge efforts with something like supplier risk, or supply chain resilience planning, which is a larger, more strategic initiative. Or how can you look at supporting small local suppliers more? So I think there are things that people can do to get creative here, and it's going to be really important to look at that closely.
Yeah, and I also wonder about programs like NMSDC, the National Minority Supplier, I forget, and WeBank, which is I forget I forget what all these things, but also the Billion Dollar Roundtable, which champions big corporations that spend $1 billion on with diverse suppliers. Or I can't remember all the details, but like all these programs where we've been celebrating achievements, and now all of a sudden, I wonder if again these same litigious people just look at that as a list of people to come after. So I um, Yeah. And I just kind of going back to the practitioner point of view, I just want to make one other point here is that my criticism of ESG tools and all these initiatives being half baked, and it gets to, you see this with greenwashing and pinkwashing. A lot of this, in my opinion, is virtue signaling, and we're doing the least amount of effort, or we're saying we'll be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2050, and knowing full well that they're not, companies aren't putting any plans in place. I'd rather just have people not like, sorry, companies not make those commitments and not
I
do.
call it marketing fluff.
Yeah, there you go, marketing fluff. Yeah, like just don't do that, because those that are hardcore will see right through it, and those that are against it, they're just going to hammer you for it. So you're getting the worst of both worlds, and I think why there's no point in doing that. Now, it would be great. I often use this example. Let's not set the rivers on fire as it happened in Cleveland, Ohio, or Cuyahoga Falls, back in, I think it was the 70s, because they were dumping so many toxic chemicals into the river that the river caught on fire. I'd be happy if we weren't polluting, and PG&E has that famous case where the Aaron Brockovich movie was about, or the fact that they can't keep their power lines from catching California on fire. But if we could just focus on the core things of the business that are not causing immediate detrimental effects, then like we could, I'm okay if we stop talking about these topics and really like roll up our sleeves and make bigger changes. Because what really is what is not being said is these are governmental failures, not just the American government, not just the EU, but collectively it's a failure of, I believe, again, the United Nations and its ability to affect change. And it's not saying I'm not anti-UN or I'm not pro-UN. It's just pointing out that we have relied on transnational NGOs to advance these agendas, and they haven't gone far enough. And so I think we're really like, and it's fallen to businesses. And I don't think it's fair to lop this all into businesses. This is governments that need to lead this, and because they're the ones that can affect the change, and they have, through many reasons, been unable to do that. So
Well, and I would argue that it's much it's more manageable and easier for larger corporations to tackle this versus small and mid-sized businesses.
sure, for sure.
Struggle with resources and change management and all the key practices that are involved in this. So if you don't have major corporations leading the way here and setting the example, and large corporations canceling programs, right? That's kind of like setting the bar for all the other businesses. And going back to your practitioner point, I would also like to add that sets reasonable goals and metrics. Like if you're going to put something in place, be reasonable and realistic about it. And again, to your point, you're not going to cure cancer tomorrow, so be honest. Here's what we think we can do this year. Here's why it's important, and here are the metrics around it. It's much better to do that and then actually accomplish something and do something meaningful versus just some, you know, pie in the sky, massive marketing fluff that we know is never going to happen anyway.
Well, and this is where I blame consultants, because consultants sort of like crank the hype machine and get everybody panicked, or analysts too. I'll cast a wide net here of, you got to do more. And I remember a couple years ago we started hearing about the triple bottom line, which was like money and I don't know, equities. I don't know. I can't even remember what it was. It was so dumb that it's like there's no triple bottom line. There's one bottom line, right? Money spent, revenue earned, right? So, like, I agree. Let's just be honest about this, and let's have some honest conversations, because, yeah, like you said it. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It's like, let's just quit fluffing around with all this jargon, and let's just like roll up our sleeves and make. I don't want to let any corporation off the hook, but also I just don't want to dump all this on at their doorstep and say, this is a real ugly mess. Can you fix it? Because that's not fair.
Mhm. And I want to we've mentioned him a few times before, but Jason Bush, who is a friend of the show, with Spend Matters, published a really good article on LinkedIn about the whole Supplier IO debacle. So if you go, it was published on February 24th. So just a couple weeks ago. Look up Jason Bush. You can go look at his articles or go look to his feed. But it does I think a very fair job of kind of summarizing what is the lawsuit, specifically what's involved, what are some of his recommendations for practitioners, and what's his take on it. So that's a good starting point if you want to get a little bit more information without having to read through hundreds of pages of kind of scary, overwhelming legal documents.
Yes. And if I may, can I throw one more shout out as we close out here? If you're feeling a little demoralized, either by the state of the world, the state of whatever nation you're in, the chaos of tariffs and everything else, friend of the show and good friend to you, Sarah, Larry Long, had a great post this morning, and I think it's a good way to close out this session today, because it just seems like this is the whole ESG thing and what's happening in it. The political football has become leaves sort of a sour taste in one's mouth, and so I just wanted to sort of end on a high note here, because Larry had a great post this morning, and it just um, I think it's I want to I took a lot from it. I immediately commented on it because it was really impactful. And he says, and I'm just quoting him now, and it says, as I've been digesting the whipsaw news around tariffs, I keep coming back to what can control. What can I control? Sorry, Larry, I screwed that up. What can I control? I can control what I think, what I feel, what I learn, what I teach, how I can help. There may not be much I can do on a grand scale. However, I can impact my own sphere and those that are in it, unquote. And I think that's a great way to close this out, is like, we don't have to solve, like, one of us is, 1,000 of us, 1,000,000 of us are not going to solve these problems. These are intransigent problems. And that's just the reality. And you have to remember, take care of yourselves, because we can we can only do what we can do, and we can't get caught up in the broader chaos. So thank you, Larry, for posting that.
Larry was one of my dear, dear friends, incredible person in the industry. If you're not following him, highly recommend you do so. He publishes a lot of really insightful things and is also obsessed with coffee. So if you want to learn all about coffee and barbecues, he posts a lot about different barbecues and ways to cook meat. Even though I'm a vegetarian,
Yeah.
I still read his barbecue posts.
Yeah, and it was funny. He has a picture of himself on this post in front of a Tim Hortons, in which I think I think it's China, but I don't know. Anyway,
It
it's in
is.
a different okay, China, yeah. And so yeah, so there you go. He likes his coffee.
All right, with that, we are going to sign off for this week. If you are not yet subscribed to the show, hit the subscribe button on YouTube. We're also available on all the major podcast platforms, and love input and comments. So if you have ideas or suggestions about this topic or anything else, feel free to drop us a note on YouTube or reach out to either of us on LinkedIn. And we will see you back next week.